Good morning, everybody, dear distinguished guests. Welcome to the seminar, The Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, an Opportunity or a Threat, and the Liberal Viewpoint. This seminar is arranged by the European Liberal Forum with support of Svenska Bildningsförbundet and together with the Friedrich Naumann Stiftung from Germany and Forest from Sweden. First, I would like to kick off this session by welcoming Mr. Carl Haglund, former defense minister, currently the member of parliament and the party leader of the Swedish People's Party in Finland. Please, the floor is yours.
Good morning, and thank you very much, and welcome also on my behalf to today's seminar. The Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership will be our topic for today. Opportunities and maybe at least some concerns. Some might even want to talk about threats today. I maybe prefer to speak about concerns. Personally, I believe that this is one of the really big issues of this mandate on a European level. It brings along a lot of opportunities, as mentioned, possibly some concerns, but foremost, a lot of opportunities if they are handled the right way. I can remember already back, let's say 5-6 years ago, when I myself had the opportunity to work in Brussels. This was already then a fairly big topic, and it's even more topical today, 5-6 years later. It's evident that the world is changing. We know that Europe is not what it used to be, in the sense that we used to be the hub of most economic activity in the world, historically very strong. When we look at where we are today, it's evident that a lot of economies around the world are growing far faster than the European economy, and it's evident that if we don't take measures to secure our position in world trade, we will fall off the track, or at least fall far behind. And in this regard, it was quite logical that some years back the European Commission started looking at opportunities that would bring along possibilities to enhance European trade and also make Europe and the EU a key player in world trade, which we have been historically. When we look at the TTIP itself, it's an agreement that raises a huge amount of discussion. It brings about a lot of concerns, but it also brings around a huge amount of information, and I would also claim disinformation. There are a lot of misunderstandings. When we look backwards, which is not always the most constructive way to approach things, but if we do so, it's evident that the Commission could have, in the initial phase, have been a little more active in putting out the information on what this is and what this will not be about. It's also clear that there were some parties that from the beginning were very, very skeptical about this without actually even wanting to get acquainted with what was the initial plan. And that also then contributed greatly to the huge amount of both information and also disinformation that has been going around. When running for a national parliament election here in Finland, you can also see that there were a lot of people that were engaged in this. When you then started working with the details, it was evident that a lot of people weren't too actually familiar with what the agreement would be about. It was more about fears, threats, and some were actually also seeing all the opportunities that it can bring along. Nevertheless, it's clear that a possible agreement cannot be accepted at any terms. It's clear that Europe has to make sure that if we have a transatlantic trade and investment partnership, it will be a partnership that is useful for both parties. It has to be fair, it has to be transparent enough, etc. Speaking of transparency, I would still claim that even though the negotiations have from time to time been accused of being non-transparent, I would claim that these negotiations has been far more transparent than a lot of previous trade agreements that the EU has made or national governments has made over the years. My time in Brussels, we adopted a few of these. They were of the same nature, but however far smaller, at least in economic volume. And when we look at the transparency transparency around these topics that have already been adopted, they were it was far less transparent, the process, compared to this process now that is still going on. So in this light, I'm very happy that the parties that are behind the seminar today decided to shed some light on this very important topic. Gives us an opportunity to analyze and discuss both opportunities, possible threats, and to also look at possible concerns and how they can be addressed. In my view, the agreement still would, and partnership would, bring along far more opportunities than threats, and I believe that it's our duty to make sure that we can reach a partnership that is acceptable, because it will be in the interest of both European taxpayers, Europeans overall, and I would also claim that from a Finnish point of view, an economy that is so driven by trade, this is a great opportunity that we can't miss. Finally, I'd like to especially welcome our speakers. We have Professor Karl-Heinz Paquet, Vice Chairman of the Friedrich Neumann Foundation for Freedom, Dean of Faculty of Economics at the University of Magdeburg. We have Mr. Niels Torvalds, member of the European Parliament from Svenska Folkpartiet. Susan Elbow, Deputy Chief of Mission, U.S. Embassy here in Helsinki. Mr. Juho Peltomaa, who's a successful startup entrepreneur. Mrs. Johanna Jakobsson, trade lawyer and researcher at the European University Institute. Mr. Jörg Wolf, Editor-in-Chief, Atlantic Community in Germany. And finally, our excellent moderator, Mats Löfström, who's also a member of the Parliament and my colleague. Let me finally thank the European Liberal Forum, the Friedrich Neumann Foundation, Svenska Bildningsförbundet, and Forest for their engagement in this very topic. Welcome once more. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Carl. It's great to have you here, even though I know that you need to leave quite soon, because Carl is the chairman of the future committee of the Finnish Parliament, and they will have a committee meeting starting this morning. Now it's an honor for me to introduce Professor Karl-Heinz Paquet, who is vice chairman of the Friedrich Neumann Stiftung, the Friedrich Neumann Foundation in Germany. He's a dean for the Faculty of Economics from the Otto von Guericke University in Magdeburg. We are very pleased that you had the opportunity to fly up here to the cold north and to give some remarks from your horizon. Please, welcome.
Mr. Chairman, ladies and gentlemen, it's a great pleasure to be here, not only in my function as Vice Chairman of the Friedrich Naumann Stiftung and as Dean of a Faculty of Economics, but also as a holder of a chair for international economics. So the issue of TTIP is not only of close to my liberal heart, but also close to my professional brains, if you like, and therefore I love to take a few minutes of general thinking about the matter. I come from Germany, and right last night I got an invitation, a little mail, to the presentation of a book by a prominent German journalist. Her name is Petra Pinzler from Die Zeit. And she has published a book with the remarkable title, about TTIP, with the remarkable title, Der Unfreihandel, unfree trade. this is a wonderful reflection of the current discussion in Germany, and you have to figure out that Petra Pinzler is a journalist at the prestigious German weekly journal Die Zeit, which has a position politically of being a little bit liberal, but with a leaning toward social democracy and Greens. So even in that community, there is a very strong feeling that TTIP is the completely wrong way. We had a recent demonstration in Germany. You read about this. 150,000 people gathering in Berlin. And that was, I think, by far the largest demonstration against a trade deal in history, I guess. And it was one of the largest crowds we had for a very long time on the streets in Germany, since, you know, the time of protests against for nuclear disarmament and against nuclear power. So there is a strong resistance by now, and the polls confirm this. Of course, those who go to the streets have loud voices. There is a famous silent majority, one thinks, but there are polls in Germany about the mood, and there have been polls in all European countries. And in Germany, the resistance is the strongest. Roughly half of the population are against it. By the way, roughly the same in Austria and Luxembourg, also two countries with huge export sectors, highly integrated into world markets, and at the central industrial heart of Europe. For me as a liberal, it's sometimes a little bit difficult to understand this emotion against it, because trade deals have been common practice over a very long period of time and have gone largely unnoticed by the general public. Nevertheless, as Mr. Haglund just pointed out, this may have been the reason why things went so wrong in the mood, because Count Lambsdorff, good friend of mine, Alexander Lambsdorff from the European Parliament, Vice President of the European Parliament from the Liberal Party of Germany, he told me that once they started the issue a couple of years ago, nobody remotely thought about a discussion like that. So the former commissioner was completely unprepared, and also the parliamentarians unprepared in terms of their communication with the public, that a resistance like this would emerge. I think there was a lot of complacency among those who favor free trade deals, and there is still a lot of complacency, even in my profession. Among professional economists, you know, you can easily agree on free trade, and you think the rest of the world is dumb. So they don't understand what really is at stake, and so you don't even try hard to explain. I think this is completely wrong. We have to go into the public. Those who favor free trade have to go out and discuss the matter in the public with open minds. Now let me briefly review the arguments which are at stake. Well, the economic ones and the political ones. I think the economics of TTIP, macroeconomics, if you like, is not very difficult to understand. TTIP promises growth and employment as basically, if you look at economic history, all efforts at integrating regions into free trade have, at least in the long run, been beneficial for prosperity and employment, and it's hard to see why this should not be the case with TTIP. Well, Europe and the US make up roughly 50% of world GDP, over 1/3 of world trade, and that by itself shows how important the deal is. Now there have been calculations, econometric calculations, of the effects. And the CPI in London came to the conclusion that there would be gains in the order of 120 billion euro for Europe, and a bit less, about roughly 100 dollars or euro. It doesn't really matter for the US. And the IFO Institute in Munich has calculated 2 million new jobs in the OECD, roughly one half of them in Europe, and remarkably, the largest share in Germany, which is not surprising if you look at the models that I used. Allow me a remark on this. These are general equilibrium models. Sorry to use a little bit of economics jargon here. Those profit most, typically, which can be expected in the course of the further integration, which is mostly in standards, harmonization of standards, cost savings in standards, and what you have. And that's, of course, good for those countries who have a highly innovative industry. Countries like Germany, like Austria, like Sweden, Finland. So they gain, and others gain much less or even lose. So it's all the more surprising that you see the resistance in Germany. But I think these numbers are, of course, to be taken with a grain of salt, because it's extremely hard to calculate the effect of tariff cuts. But here we have non-tariff barriers. And non-tariff barriers are complex administrative issues, and you have to weigh them in terms of their cost savings when you simplify administration and reduce non-tariff barriers, and that is, of course, speculation. To a large extent, it's how you put the parameters. But at the end of the day, the numbers don't really matter all that much. I think there are gains, and there have always been gains from these type of integration in a long-term perspective, but there may be more in terms of really setting an economic environment which can expect it to be stable and sustainable over a long period of time. It's like a big commitment. And the big commitment, that's exactly the same in the European Union. When we went for the common market in 1992, we had wonderful calculations about the effects. Nobody knows whether they came true. But the real point was sustainability in the long run of a stable and predictable free trade framework. So I think it's hard to argue about the economics that there wouldn't be gains. The politics is, in my view, even more important. Well, it has been mentioned by Mr. Haglund in his short remarks at the beginning, but clearly Europe and the US make up a big part in world GDP and world trade, but it's going to shrink over the next 30, 40, 50 years. The big NICs, the newly industrializing countries in the world, like China, India, Brazil, Indonesia, all of them, with more than half of the world population, grow fast and will make an ever larger share of world trade. And that means that the political weight in the world economy shifts towards these countries. I find this is very good, that these countries grow. We want to have an integration in the world economy. But let me politically say, as a liberal, Europe and America have one thing in common, at least one thing. They grew out of a liberal spirit of the 19th century. And that liberal spirit necessarily included as one major stepping stone free trade. That is not so in China. That is not so in India. All these countries are more what I like to call state capitalist countries. With a strong and not predictable influence of the state, with legal systems which are by far not yet comparable to what we have in the United States, in Europe. It's a matter of values as well, whether you can transplant these values of the transatlantic values into the new world with the different weights in world politics. And that's a very, very important argument from a liberal point of view. well beyond the numbers of additional economic growth of what you have. Now, what do the skeptics say? Well, there are basically three arguments. The first is transparency, the second is standards, and the third is investor protection. These are the three big issues. Now, Mr. Haugland has already made the point about transparency. I think the EU has made a lot of mistakes at the beginning in this, but I think they are changing. Especially Cecilia Malmström has dramatically opened up the discussion about the free trade issue. She's going to be in Berlin next week on Thursday. I see her then. But it's a genuine effort to approach the public and say, okay, guys, I understand you. I take you seriously, your arguments, and let's discuss it. This is, I think, very important. It has changed to some extent the climate of the discussion, I think, but it is, of course, a tough job to do. Now, of course, the kind of information that is provided to the public by now, to the parliaments, and there are well-established procedures by now of doing so. By the way, that not all parliamentarians really look very carefully at the papers, because everybody, all people who have ever been concerned with trade agreements know that this is the most boring stuff you can look at. So most parliamentarians don't really take the profit from the information which is provided, but that's okay. But at the end of the day, one must say that trade negotiations and trade agreements, as all negotiations and agreements, are a matter of the executive. I'm sorry. And you cannot display your strategy before you negotiate and discuss it in the public. You know, I'm always saying in Germany that we would have never had German unification in the 4+2 negotiations in early 90s if Hans-Dietrich Genscher, who was at the time conducting the negotiations, would have to have put the whole strategy publicly on the table before negotiating. That's completely impossible. That's an illusion. The parliaments afterwards have to decide, and that's absolutely okay and democratic. Second, standards. Very briefly. I think the problem with standards is that they're extremely important, that they are really the core of the matter. Because if you take all the engineering, speak with guys from the car industry, and they tell you how much could really be saved in the long run if you had a standardization of procedures, of requirements, and what you have in different rules and regulations in America and Europe. And this is absolutely harmless stuff. The problem is that there are some fields, food, health, where the emotions run high. You know, when the Germans talk about the chlorine chicken, which the Americans want to force upon us, this is a very emotional matter, although the same people go to have a chlorine chicken when they are in New York and eat Kentucky fried chicken and don't die afterwards. But be that as it may, there are sensitivities on both sides of the Atlantic. The North Americans don't like raw milk cheese, whatever. I think I would really put that aside and say, okay, we have to have some special rules for these areas. They must not prevent a trade deal from coming about, because there are always some emotional issues. You know, the French about culture, the Germans are about genetically modified food, but there must be a negotiation solution for that, and it cannot hinder the huge gains that we could have in other fields. Okay? I think this discussion is already getting a little bit quieter at this point. However, the big remaining issue is investor protection. This is really a very, very difficult field. Because by now in Germany, and not only in the classical circles of those who oppose free trade, the idea of seeing some arbitration going on completely at the sidelines of the public legal systems is really frightening many people. It is considered to be undemocratic and against the legal the legal framework of countries. I don't go into the details here. I'm not even not a specialist in this field, but I think this is a real stumbling block in a country like Germany to get an agreement to the whole thing. Now, Cecilia Malmström has already reacted and has now proposed an arbitration, an investor-state dispute settlement procedure where publicly nominated judges are doing the job and not just some private arbitrators. She also wants to go into the direction of an international court of trade. The big question here, however, I find this a good idea, but the big question is, of course, what will the Americans say? Because for the Americans, investor protection seems to be an absolute priority. Now, so much for my brief introduction here. In summary, I think that we have a real uphill struggle in front of us if this trade agreement is to come about. In my view, it would be very important that those who favor the trade agreement, and I think for good reason, step out, discuss matters, and discuss matters not only rationally, but also with a sort of emotional involvement, which is kind of typical for those who oppose the agreement, and which gives them the upper hand on moral grounds. And that's the big issue, you know. As long as you stand as a defender of free trade, as somebody who favors global capitalism, that's not a very emotional deal. We have to look at what it means for freedom in the world, for prosperity in the world in the long run, for the values, the liberal values that underlie not only our economies, but also our societies. And there, I think, America and Europe still have a very important role to play in the future, and maybe the awful events in the last two or three weeks have reminded us a little bit that there are more important things in the world in terms of values than too much worrying about chlorine chicken. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Paquet, for the viewpoint from Germany and from the academic field. I'm glad that you will join us in the panel debate after we have some more introductory remarks. We have a broad palette of speakers today that will also join us after their remarks for a panel discussion where we'll also take questions from the audience. First, we will have Mr. Nils Torvalds, a member of the European Parliament that has also been a correspondent in the United States for 4 years for the National Broadcasting Company. So he has also a very strong transatlantic perspective and working very hard with the TTIP in the European Parliament. Please, the floor is yours, Nils.
Thank you, Mats. Well, you should probably say that I was also a correspondent in Russia.
Yep.
So,
but they're not part in TTIP.
It cuts both ways. That was a very good introduction by Professor Paquet, and it actually, I had one thought coming up in my mind. It's always better when people from Magdeburg comes to Finland than when Finns go to Magdeburg. That is a reference to the 30 Years' War when the Finns came with disastrous results. As a person coming from the coast of Finland, used to sailing, going by boat, we usually take a tack. So I'm going to take a slightly different tack on this issue. The question we are asking ourselves, and in Professor Paquet's latest remark, there was a allusion to that. Why do we have a very fierce and very well organized opposition to the TTIP? And I think we should try to look slightly deeper into the matter, because it has to do with emotions, but not just with emotions. I think it's actually an existential question in a certain way. And I think that the watershed is fairly long back in history. I think the watershed is 1975. That was the end of the golden age of capitalism. That was the beginning of deindustrialization of Europe and the States. That was the end of the welfare state as we knew it at that time, meaning the Swedish model. That was the rise of petrodollars, and with petrodollars you got something else. You got the rise of the debt economy. If you look at the statistics, you see that from 71 we tend to take more and more loans. We don't earn the money we use. We tend to take more and more loans, and that is the curve by which we take more loans is a very sharp rise. And we don't, and that's a reference to the discussion in Finland today, we don't seem to be able to curb that curve. But 1975 was at the same time also the rise of the House of Saudi. And when I say that was the rise of the House of Saudi, then you probably think, so what the hell has that to do with the trade agreement? But it has. The rise of the House of Saudi at the same time meant the rise of Wahhabism in that part of the world. As a correspondent in Russia during the late 90s, I went to Chechnya, I think, 4 or 5 times. I went to all the madrasas financed by petrodollars. I saw a guy from Lebanon fighting on Chechen ground. He had come there via Afghanistan, and you can probably guess who had financed his first Kalashnikov. So what we have in the background is actually something where the building stones, as we thought they would be, they are actually redistributed and creating a lot of uncertainty in the world. So we have political processes in almost all market economies in Europe where we go up and down in different directions. Well, I think the German Liberal Party is a very good example. They went from sort of a very good result in one day, and the next day they're almost down at zero. We have the same process in Finland. We see the same process in Sweden, where the government today is scared almost to death of being forced to do something, because if they have a new elections in Sweden next year, we know what the biggest party would be. So we see very disturbing political processes in the background. And that's part of the emotional background against which the TTIP is actually discussed. So my guess would be that we have to create a sort of idea of the future which is more realistic than we usually are creating. There is a tendency in European politics, and I can see it, too much of it actually in the European Parliament. There is a very nice German way, das Flucht nach vorne. You leave the problems behind you, and you just say, you paint some wonderful landscape for the future. And you say, when we go and we don't look to the sides, then we're going to reach sort of almost the gate of heaven. And I think this is, plainly speaking, that's stupid. It's people don't believe in those illusions. So we have to be more sincere. We have to take the problems as they are in today's world, and we have to address them. And we're going to have very serious problems, because when I said that the watershed was 75, that means that we are behind. We are behind the curve, and it's going to ask a lot of effort from us to be on the curve. And the only way of being on the curve is to see how deep the problems actually are. Because we had a deindustrialization in Europe. We lost a lot of working places. So, and when some of us we are saying that this is going to create 2 million new jobs. Do you think that anybody believes us? The answer is no. Because we have painted those illusions already earlier. We have to show that concrete steps today are able to solve the questions. If we look at the content of the TTIP, well, Professor Paquet already said that the investment protection is sort of the central stone of it. All the other ways are going, if in one case going probably in the favor of USA, in other cases it will favor Europe. We don't know exactly by what mathematics. But the question of investment protection will be central, and if we aren't able to find a feasible solution, and Professor Paquet already said that we don't actually know how much the Americans hate the tack Mrs. Malmsted was taking on this issue. Well, emotionally, I'm afraid that they don't like it very much. But if we want to have this solution, because that we know that we have a lot of small companies that aren't able to come into the US market because the cost of getting into the market is too high for middle-sized and small companies. They have to hire an American lawyer, and you know that American lawyers have their hands in the pockets, usually not their own pockets. So it's an extremely cumbersome process. But if we are able to show that we are on the curve solving today's problem, if we are able to achieve a fairly good solution to the investment protection, then we are able to solve the problem. That's sort of my take on the question. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Niels, for that interesting take of the TTIP, and we will definitely come back to those in the panel discussion later on. Now it's a pleasure for me to welcome Ms. Susan Elbow, Deputy Chief of the U.S. Embassy of the U.S. Mission to Finland, to give the American perspective of the TTIP. We are very glad to have you here. Welcome.
Thank you, Mats. It's really a pleasure to be here this morning with you all and represent the American point of view. I think, as you can imagine, perhaps in typically optimistic American manner, I'm going to focus on the benefits and the opportunities of the agreement, and I'm going to leave the concerns to the discussion. It was a year ago in September, I participated in another TTIP discussion here in Finland, and it had the title, TTIP, Just the Tip of the Iceberg? And that at that time I said, far from being an iceberg with hidden submerged risks, I saw TTIP as a huge cake. And actually saw a huge cake with TTIP then as a big extra layer on it with lots of icing on the top. We already have an incredibly strong and vibrant transatlantic trade and investment relationship, as Professor Paquet described. And just one example, for Europe accounts for 60% of corporate America's total foreign assets globally. So it's just one data point about the size of the relationship. So clearly the goal of TTIP for us is to make our trade and investment relationship yet bigger and stronger, to add to the cake and let everyone eat more of it. If successful, TTIP will join more than 800 million citizens, arguably the most well-off and sophisticated consumers in the world, in an agreement that will make it easier to trade and do business. This, in turn, our point of view, will promote growth and prosperity in the transatlantic sphere and beyond. For us, this is a huge joint undertaking between the United States and Europe that's worth pursuing with all the energy and resources that we can muster. So the numbers are really big. What always strikes me in our relationship is when you take something that's so enormous, and because transatlantic trade represents such a huge, or the whole economic sphere represents such a huge part of our global GDP, you increase it even by a small amount, and that translates into very big numbers. My source for a lot of these numbers is the Johns Hopkins Center for Transatlantic Relations. They have a lot of good data on this. And I'm going to give you just two of the numbers that they produced. One is that they calculate with transatlantic zero tariffs, US and EU exports could be increased by 17%. And they also say that a 25% reduction in non-tariff barriers could increase combined EU and US GDP by 106 billion. So again, the numbers are really big. So for us, there's absolutely no doubt that this will be an economic boost from the agreement. But I also want to say a few words about the geopolitical case, again, underlining what Professor Paquet mentioned a little bit earlier. Europeans and Americans, we've been the world's trendsetters for the last 2 centuries. Together, we forged the liberal international order that aided globalization and brought about a huge increase in trade and prosperity. We want to see that order not only continue, but to be strengthened. TTIP, we believe, has the potential to renew the West's economic vitality and enable us to continue to serve as the anchor of liberal democracy amid a world of very rapid change. TTIP would also put us in a much stronger position to encourage multilateral liberalization and to promote an open, transparent, and non-discriminatory trade and investment climate worldwide. So we would be in the driver's seat, strongly encouraging other countries to accept our generally high standards on safety, on consumer, labor, and environmental protection. There are 2 areas of the agreement that I want to highlight briefly. And the first has been mentioned a couple of times now, and that has to do with regulation. One of the major goals of the agreement, and this is a part of the agreement that's difficult to wade through, it's also not sexy, but it is trying to eliminate or avoid unnecessary costs or burdens that arise due to different regulations or standards on either side of the Atlantic. And here, the theory is fairly simple, that if regulators on one side could agree to rely on or accept the inspections performed by the other side. So we're not talking about harmonization here, but some form of mutual recognition. So whether that's medical devices or pharmaceuticals, for instance, the benefits are threefold. Regulators would benefit because their resources would stretch further. Companies would benefit because they wouldn't have to undergo several duplicative tests for their products, and consumers would benefit through the opportunity to have lower prices, increased availability of products, and more efficient regulatory oversight. In working to promote the TTIP, we've spoken to a lot of Finnish companies, and one example in this area is the Finnish company Plan Mecca, which is it's a leading manufacturer of dental equipment. The United States is its top export destination, and the U.S. military is its single biggest customer. It's clear to them that TTIP would make possible faster regulatory approvals, and this would in turn directly contribute to the company's profitability. The second area I briefly want to highlight is the agreements focused on small and medium-sized enterprises, SMEs. They form the backbone of our economies. They're responsible for 2/3 of the new jobs in the United States and 80% of the new jobs in the European Union. They grow faster, they pay higher wages, and they foster innovation. However, the vast majority of small and medium-sized enterprises in both our countries are not exporting. So as a result, we see a huge opportunity here for TTIP to unlock that potential and for companies to find export markets for the first time on both sides of the Atlantic. In the chapter on SMEs, there's also additional help, new online services to facilitate networking, matchmaking, provisions to promote a duty-free digital marketplace, which plays a large role in small and medium-sized companies, and a variety of additional measures to help them increase their possibilities to export. So let me conclude by just mentioning briefly a few words about the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the TPP agreement, which was just recently concluded. It's online, so everybody can take a look at it and all of its chapters. Many of the elements we seek to achieve in the TTIP are in the TPP. And it's a very ambitious agreement that, to quote President Obama, contains the highest trade standards ever negotiated. This was a very difficult agreement to conclude. The countries that are involved are amazingly disparate: communist Vietnam, Peru, Mexico, Canada, Brunei. And for a while there, it looked like it was on the rails. But this was a major top priority of the Obama administration, and they got the agreement negotiated. We know trade is politically difficult, and that no agreement is perfect, and it's really easy to be negative and find all the things wrong with it. But at the end of the day, the decision we have to make is whether we're better off with TTIP or with the alternative future we're likely to face. Economically and strategically, we think the choice is crystal clear. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Susan, for the American perspective, and we will also come back to that more in the panel discussion later on. Now I would like to give the floor to Mr. Juho Peltomaa, who is a startup entrepreneur, and I think I saw him at the Slush conference here in Helsinki for a couple of weeks ago, even though we don't have any Slush yet here in Helsinki. But that was a great event for also combining American and European entrepreneurs. So please, the floor is yours, Juho.
Thank you very much, and nice to meet you all. I'm here for my funny hair. Well, not exactly. I'm actually a startup entrepreneur, and I'm not an expert in TTIP. I'm not claiming to be one. I'm not an expert in free trade. I don't know actually much about these things. I've been Googling lately a lot because I've been a bit scared of this speech, and so I know the basics, but there's no way to kind of argue that I would be as good of an expert than the other speakers here. But what I am is a startup entrepreneur, and I have had a couple of pretty successful companies so far. One in the graphics technology industry, and we actually sold that one to the US, to NVIDIA, with $37 million dollars. So dollars, euros, who cares? So I have some experience in this kind of trade. Also, kind of as a startup entrepreneur, I have some expertise in taking in investment rounds. Actually, right now I'm taking one in to my new company called Immersal. We are doing augmented reality stuff, and one really nice investor from the States would like to give us a seed round, and I barely can believe how hard it is, because he would like to operate under the SafeDoc system, which is a kind of widespread system in the States for doing these pretty simple investment rounds. And then kind of our lawyer said right away that no way in hell is that going to stand in Finland, and now we have two lawyers or lawyers both in the States and in Finland, and they are trying to figure out how to move this tiny amount of money to Finland, and I think it will all go to their expenses, so this is not looking good. And also I have this experience of kind of a regulation, because regulation is the worst enemy of a startup. It isn't so bad for a big company, as you all know, when you can hire 40 people to fight back the bureaucracy. But for a startup, I have actually seen during my maybe 4 companies that I have been co-founding, I have seen 2 burnouts of a CEO because of regulations, like too much bureaucracy. 70% of startup CEO's time is taken to filling some kind of stupid forms, and no one will ever read them, but they have to be filled anyway. And this is really sad, because I have seen two guys like almost going to mental hospital because they haven't got time to focus on the real business of the startup. Instead, they just play these ridiculous games. And so in those respects, actually startups really need deregulation, and kind of when I'm thinking of free trade, as said, I'm not an expert, but for me it's a natural state of things. When you kind of have 2 nations, they are just kind of selling stuff to each other, and everything is pretty happy and okay. Then where the trouble comes is when 1 or 2 companies, or maybe some interest groups, begin to like this kind of hey, I'm better in my country, so I would like to stick to this kind of situation, and they will begin to kind of defend their own interests instead of the country's interests. And this is pretty basic stuff for you, I bet, but this has kind of I only understood this lately, so I'm excited about this. And kind of as mentioned, if everything would be kind of as it's supposed to be, then we would need no TTIP or that kind of stuff, because we would have no bureaucracy, we would have no regulation, we would have no obstacles for the trade. But now these all kinds of big companies, and they are too well off, so they would like to continue as such, and they have built these kind of bunkers that we want to stay here and we don't want to leave, and no one, they have even kind of affected our laws and so on, and they are not about to kind of leave easily. And for me, the free trade is kind of blowing those bunkers and kind of getting equal opportunities for SMEs and big corporate giants. And of course, kind of when you look at the negotiations and the PR catastrophe that has been going on with TTIP. By the way, I am a PR person, so I'm willing to do some work, but not for free. It has been horrifying, and kind of I think mainly the main problem is that these are so secretive and not at all open. Well, someone could say that they are not they have been pretty transparent, and maybe that, but in my world these have been really secretive and not at all open negotiations. And to me, at least personally, it seems that the only kind of reason for being so secretive is that there are these shady interest groups and there are these big corporations. For example, yesterday I read from The Guardian that all of a sudden this really secretive text has from the EU have popped up in Exxon's kind of emails. So it sounds bad. I don't know even if it's true, but it sounds really bad. So my suggestion, because I want this to happen, is that we would kind of open up the negotiations, open up the kind of things so that I would know as much as Exxon at this point. So that's not an unfair thing to ask. And one of my main motivation also, why I really love TTIP is because I hate Russia, or not Russian people. I have many Russian friends, but I hate Mr. Putin and kind of all the corrupt politicians there. And reason for hating Russia is actually they are anti-democratic. They don't want free trade. They couldn't care less about transparency and so on and so on. And I would like to stay as far away from Russia as I could, which means moving towards Western Europe. Well, that being said, I wouldn't like to move towards Western Europe by kind of in an undemocratic way, in non-transparent way, and so on. There wouldn't be no point. So I would say that this is a good thing, but we will have to make this happen in a transparent and kind of open way. I actually noticed I always want everyone to kind of figure out both sides of the story and remain somewhat neutral and trying to kind of not bang their fists in the table, instead of kind of keep an open mind. And I noticed that the URL, like the web address of this event, was actually treat or an opportunity. So not threat, but treat. So I kind of liked it. I think this might not be a neutral thing. But anyway, I'm totally for the free trade, and I hope that we can open up a bit the discussion. So at least I will be a happy camper then, and maybe fewer of my CEOs will burn out them. Then thank you.
Trick or treat. Thank you for your remarks. I see now that we will have very good elements for the panel discussions in all kind of discussions. Jufo was speaking about lawyers, and the next speaker is a trade lawyer and researcher at the European University Institute. Ms. Johanna Jakobsson, I know that you are an expert on this, so we will be very happy to hear your expertise. So please.
Thank you very much for the introduction, Mats, and very nice to see you all here this morning. I'm very pleased to be here. I'm not sure if I'm an expert, especially in this specific agreement, but indeed I call myself a trade lawyer, and that is because I'm first of all a lawyer by education, and at the moment I'm doing research, especially on international trade and on free trade agreements. One of which, at the moment, one of the most topical ones is definitely the TTIP agreement. I think I will try to speak more from a bit of general point of view and maybe give a bit more framework to this agreement and to these negotiations from a researcher's point of view. Personally, I'm very much liberal myself. I stand very much for free trade. But I think it's relevant to actually make the remark that when we're talking about free trade agreements, as Professor Paquet very well noted in the beginning through the remarks on this book that recently came out, free trade agreements are actually anything but about free trade. And I think now free trade agreements with the TTIP have very much come into publicity, and people have started talking about them, but it's often left without noticing that actually free trade negotiations have been going on for decades, and they have been going on with more and more countries through multilateral negotiations. And from an economic point of view, this is the so-called preferred way of approaching free trade. And I think from economic point of view, from a research point of view, I would always want to bring up the point that, like, if we really want to proceed with free trade and make the world a better working place and better place for international commerce, the multilateral route is definitely should be the priority. And when I'm talking about the multilateral route, I mean nowadays it's the World Trade Organization. But what has been happening during the past 20 years or so is that the multilateral route, the World Trade Organization, has been pretty much completely blocked. And this is because countries nowadays negotiate on topics that are no longer possible to agree upon with countries with very different cultural and societal preferences. So this is the reason why we now see a movement between countries who share similar values, similar cultures and societies. And they have realized that the only way to proceed in trade liberalization is actually to turn towards free trade agreements. And such bilateral or regional agreements have existed for hundreds of years. But we see a significant increase in those agreements during the last 20 years. When the WTO was established in 1995, when there was amazing international enthusiasm for a liberal world order, for countries for the first time coming together to an international organization to agree on things related to free trade, something that used to be only about tariff barriers, about trading goods. But with the event of the WTO, countries started to negotiate it on much more complex topics, such as services, regulatory barriers, sanitary issues, technical barriers, all sorts of things. But very soon we noticed that countries were not able to go very far with these issues. And with more and more issues coming to the table, especially such as investment, we see more and more fragmentation and variety in countries' point of views. This is very much an issue about values. Countries have different values, they have different regulatory preferences, they are having difficulties in coming together. So now I think we should really understand that TTIP is a culmination of this development. We see two of the biggest trading blocs in the world coming together, and which is as itself already quite amazing, because US and EU share, in many respects, they share very different attitudes toward regulation and towards values as well. But if we are looking at those blocks in the international context, we see that EU and US actually have quite a lot in common. And finally, it seems that they are understanding that they should maybe join their forces because they see the threat coming from other emerging economies. But I think it should be always important to keep in mind that the freest trade is definitely not something that is formed between specific blocks, even though that may seem as an attractive alternative. But in the long term, I think definitely the best solution for everybody is to proceed with all countries. Because when we have only certain countries or blocks coming together, it can lead to very long-term consequences which might not even be beneficial for ourselves always, because when trade is free only between certain actors, it means that trade gets diverted, gets distracted, and we actually might lose those partners or sources of trade that might be the most efficient for us. But I also think that in today's environment where the multilateral WTO negotiations are not moving forward, it is the right strategy for countries who are willing to go further and to liberalize state trade. It is a valid strategy to turn into preferential so-called free trade agreements, bilaterally or regionally. But I would like to share my own concern a little bit, just to keep in mind that it's not always, from the strategic or long-term point of view, it's not the best alternative, but it's maybe the only alternative that we have available at the moment. Another issue I would like to bring up is really the background of European and American trade policies, because they're quite different actually. And And it's relevant to understand why TTIP is now so popular for economic reasons, and why is it so popular for other reasons, which is mainly about the shared values. First, from the economic point of view, I think Europe is coming a bit behind the United States in its understanding of how free trade agreements can work to boost economic activity. Traditional European Union has been actually very active in concluding trade agreements with other areas and other countries, but the main driving force in those agreements has been not so trade-driven, but it has been about the integration of the neighboring countries to the European model of legislating and European model of society. And Europe's main interests have been in bringing countries closer to it, and also in promoting development in areas a bit further from Europe. On the other hand, the American trade policy has been more commercially driven in the especially through NAFTA, and then also through some other strategic agreements that the US has concluded bilaterally with certain countries. And I think from the Americans' point of view, they have always been a bit more practical and interested in their own economic benefits. And now I see a certain development where this is kind of shifting, and where Europeans are coming more commercial driven and Americans are coming more value driven. So in 2011, Europe adopted a new trade strategy, which was called Global Europe, Trade for Growth and Employment, or something like that. And this is where the European Union for the first time actually laid out its trade strategy from a very commercial point of view, where European Commission was very straightforward, saying that, okay, now we have to adopt a bit different strategy. We cannot just think about development or about integration, and we have to actually start thinking how we can open new markets to create more employment, and to be a bit more aggressive in driving European interests. And at the same time, in the United States, during the last few years, I think the Americans have started to talk very much about the so-called value-driven trade policy, where the Americans have very much seemed to see now the world as constant competition of different value systems, and where the Americans understand that in order for the liberal Western values to win, we have to employ pretty big weapons, so to say, and because America, as well as the European Union, has huge economic power, they understand that actually by including their own preferred values in their trade agreements, they might be able to implement, or even, you can say, even force them upon others. And I'm not saying that this is necessarily a good or bad thing. I think it's just important to understand. And this might explain why countries who are outside these agreements, they are not always too keen on this kind of big economic power being used for value-driven purposes. But as an EU citizen, as a liberal, I think this agreement is mainly a positive development, and it will definitely boost the European economy. But I think it's important to keep in mind that sometimes when we are bundling up too many things together, especially when you have a trade agreement, which is traditionally, from the trade logic, it's for opening markets. When you start putting a lot of politically motivated things in it, especially when we're talking about very deep issues such as cultural values, it gets very risky. We see that it's very risky already within the European Union. If you're asking why Europe has not managed to liberalize its services market, it's because even European countries are very different. They don't share each other's cultural preferences or societal preferences, which is very relevant for such an issue as the integration of services. This will be enormously difficult between European Americans. It will be, well, at the moment it's almost impossible on a larger scale. But it's worth trying. It is worth trying. But while we're doing that, we should keep in mind that even though regulations can be annoying, as the previous speaker said. It would be much easier if we could just do away with regulations and bureaucracy. I'm sure that would be very beneficial for business, but regulations are in place for a reason. And we Europeans have our own regulations, Americans have their own regulations. We might be able to come together and do away with part of them, but it's more about coordinating on those issues that where we actually can agree that the end result is similar enough. But when we have regulations that are in place for different policy preferences, the job gets much more difficult. But from an economic point of view, it's very important to understand that all the biggest benefits that we've been told about this agreement, about the TTIP agreement, they are only attainable if we manage to reach a very, very high level of market coordination between EU and US. And at the moment, personally, I'm quite skeptical that we will ever get there. We will definitely not get to the beautiful numbers that we've been publicly told. I wish we could, but I don't think it's feasible. But as Professor Paguet said in his opening remarks, I think this agreement is definitely more about market integration. It's about creating a predictable integrated market where EU and US can work on. They can create a similar front and a common market, so to say, and this way bring more economic activity and predictability. So that is definitely the biggest benefit that will be brought about if this agreement is successful. But we should be really careful about those huge promises of big amounts of money, and I think the public should not be misled with these figures, because when voters are doing their choices, they have to be well informed, and they have to know that the aim here is very much in regulatory cooperation, and those financial benefits are only attainable if we go quite far in our integration of our markets. I'm not against that integration, but I think that we have to keep the voters very well informed, and there is definitely improvement in this. I think the politicians on both sides have now understood that they have to be very transparent about these negotiations. As was already mentioned here before, and which is very true, trade negotiations have always been conducted in secrecy. And this is, it's a necessity. Nobody's going to negotiate if they have to be informing all the time and talking after every session. They have to tell what was going on, even though nothing has been agreed. It's impossible. But we have to also keep in mind that what has been happening in trade negotiations during the past decades is very, very different than what is going on now. Now we're talking about regulatory coordinations, issues which are very deep in the national sovereignty, and we have to keep the voters updated. We have to engage the civil society. First, because we are democracies, that's what you have to do. If we are really for liberal values, we have to engage in this kind of market coordination in the same way as we do within our own domestic borders, of course. And secondly, if we don't do that, this agreement will not happen. It just will not happen. We're facing a similar danger as we did about 5 years ago with the ACTA agreement, the anti-counterfeiting trade agreement, which was basically destroyed by the civil society. And I really see signs of danger of that happening now in relation to TTIP. And most of the irrelevant issues like the chlorine chickens are brought up to the agenda. And it's very much a question of giving out the enough information, correct information. But as also was mentioned before, now we have moved a bit more strategic, systemic parts of these negotiations, mainly to investment. And these are issues which are difficult, and they are not as simple as trade negotiations. Trade negotiators always want to imply, but I think it's very much about the right level of information and involvement of civil society just to get the result right. Just a final remark. On the geopolitics, as you might already guess from how I started, as a free trader, and as I said, multilateral route is always better. I think we have to liberalize trade across the world. We cannot just do it with the Americans. Okay, this is the easy way, but we have to take the hard route as well, especially in today's situation, how we see it, how the world is fragmenting, how we see different terrorist groups coming about, people who are living in poverty are finally finding routes, unfortunately aggressive routes, to attack the Western values. We have to engage these people, we have to engage these countries, and trade is the best way to do that. Because this agreement, TTIP, will have many positive effects on many outsiders as well, but it will also have some negative effects if it comes about on some third countries. And we cannot forget those countries. Especially we cannot forget the poorest countries, which are usually engaged through the multilateral route, where the benefits are accrued to everyone. In these kind of bilateral negotiations, the poorest and the weakest are left out. And even for our own benefit, we have to make sure that we engage those countries. And when we do that, I don't think the value-driven trade policy is necessarily the best route, because societies are so different, countries have different values, and it's more efficient to focus more on trade issues and leave the values a bit aside. Thank you.
Thank you, Johanna. I think that you summed it up when you said it's the easy way to just do it with the Americans. So we will see if this will be easy or not, the whole agreement, when we will come back to the discussion. The last speaker here today is Mr. Jörg Wolf, Editor-in-Chief for the Atlantic Community in Germany. Welcome.
Thank you, Mats. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for inviting me. I agree very much with what the other speakers have said, so I'll try not to repeat too much. I'd like to make three arguments. One is that TTIP is more important for geostrategic reasons than for economic reasons. The second is that more information, more debate, more transparency will not convince the TTIP opponents to change their mind. And the third is that a narrow TTIP agreement that gets ratified soon is better than a comprehensive TTIP agreement that might never get ratified. Regarding the first point, a comprehensive TTIP deal will increase GDP by 0.3% to 0.5%. Those are the expectations of credible economic studies. One of them even commissioned by the EU Commission. It's from the European Centre on Policy Analysis in Britain. So the economic benefits are really small, even considering that, of course, the EU and US market and economies are pretty big. So to put this in perspective, 0.3 to 0.5%, that's as much of an economic boost as we are getting next year from the low oil price. So it's, everybody can decide for themselves whether this is, and TTIP will get this in 10 years after it has been implemented. And so everybody can decide whether this is a lot or not. And a less comprehensive, more narrow TTIP deal will only lead to 0.1%. And a more narrow deal is more likely, I believe, as the TTIP negotiations have been going on for a long time, and it seems quite unrealistic that the negotiations will be concluded by the end of the Obama term. Because, apparently the US and the EU don't agree on that much. And Johanna has made great arguments on why the difficulty lies with the standards and with the regulation, but that's actually the part that would boost the economy more. So because the economic benefits are rather small, I believe that the geostrategic benefits of TTIP are at least as important and should be stressed more in the debate. Strengthening the transatlantic bond is important at a time when we cannot take US involvement in Europe for granted anymore. TTIP keeps the US invested in Europe, literally and figuratively. This is especially important for the Baltic states, I believe. Also, demonstrating transatlantic unity towards Russia and the emerging powers is important. TTIP would be a sign that the West is still to be reckoned with, that we get stuff done. And thirdly, TTIP would be promoting the liberal rules-based world order, setting global standards that protect the environment, public health, and labor. And Europe and the US can do this now, as we still have a strong economy. In later years, when China and India and other emerging powers will have a bigger market share, it will be more difficult to set these standards. And we might become standard takers rather than standard setters. And Johanna, of course, made very important arguments that this should be done through multilateral trade agreements with the WTO, but because the Doha round has been going forever, I believe that that TTIP could give a boost to the WTO later on, that other countries realize that we have to get on board. The problem is, one of the problems is that the German public does not appreciate these geostrategic arguments. Geostrategic thinking is, we don't do that. And I got the impression that many other Europeans don't do this kind of thinking either. Germany, however, benefits more from TTIP economically than many other countries. According to a study by the European Council on Foreign Relations, Germany is going to benefit economically from TTIP more than Finland and Sweden. But there is more opposition to TTIP in Germany than in Finland and Sweden. Why is that? Professor Paquet mentioned this huge anti-TTIP demonstration in October. And there was a university conducting a survey, interviewing the demonstrators. And that survey the result was that most protesters are concerned that TTIP will threaten our democracy. It will reduce the rule of law by giving too much power to big corporations, primarily through this ISDS mechanism, but also via regulatory cooperation. They believe that small and medium-sized enterprises do not benefit as much as the big corporations. The other concern that TTIP would lower food standards and so on, that was a concern, but not as big as this concern about that big corporation will threaten democracy. And the problem is that mistrust towards big corporations and the term liberalization is huge. And there's also huge mistrust towards the EU and towards the US. So TTIP has the problem that there are 5 things coming together. It's the concern about corporations, it's the concern about the Americans, it's the concern about the EU. Enlightenment is great, debate is great, transparency is great, but I'm afraid we won't achieve progress on those TTIP negotiations with that, because the gut feeling is so strong. Cecilia Malmström, the EU Commission, have released many documents on TTIP. So there's much more transparency. But the problem is that only very few people read these documents. And yes, of course, it's legal text, it's complicated, it's long. It's very difficult for non-experts to understand. But and the second problem is that TTIP opponents just don't trust the EU Commission. They don't trust the government. And if there is no trust, more transparency, more debate won't help. So is public opposition important? Yes, it is important. We need broad public support for TTIP because a comprehensive TTIP agreement has to be ratified by all 28 EU parliaments. A more narrow agreement might only need to be ratified by the EU Parliament, but a comprehensive definitely by the 28 national parliaments. And in Europe there are always somewhere elections. Fortunately, that's a good thing. Sorry? Yes, and then and there are elections in the US next year. The US concluded the Trans-Pacific Partnership, but Hillary Clinton in the election campaign is voicing her opposition against it, although this was a project she started. So it's a huge political issue. And in 2017, there are national elections in Germany. So that will also be, and TTIP could be a big issue over there. So what I believe is required is that we rebuild trust in the liberal agenda. But winning public support takes time. That's why I suggest that the EU and the US conclude a narrow, modest TTIP agreement by the end of Obama's term. That means focusing on the common sense agenda, rather than everything that is on the corporation's wish list. Focusing on the non-controversial items, and there are many. Eliminating tariffs rather than the non-tariff barriers. And no ISDS, or maybe this investment court system that Malmström has proposed. And then, in a few years, when we see the benefits from this agreement, and when the TTIP critics will realize that TTIP has not brought an end to democracy or the rule of law, then we can attempt to take the next step and focus on harmonization of norms and standards, and do regulatory cooperation. Which I think is regulatory cooperation. I think is a good thing. It's important. TTIP should be a living agreement, but right now it's just too controversial. The problem, however, with that approach is that the US is not interested in a narrow agreement. The American position is that, okay, we've been discussing this for 2 years, it takes a lot of effort to get it through Congress, it has to be a comprehensive thing. And the US also insists on ISDS. And the US is in a better position because the US has just concluded the Trans-Pacific Partnership. And it's important for the EU not to fall behind when these mega regional agreements are concluded. So that means the proposition that I've made might not be realistic at all. But I guess this is still the best way possible, because the alternative would be that TTIP will be negotiated forever but not ratified. And that shouldn't be, that's negative as well. Thank you very much, and I'm sorry I wasn't more optimistic.
Thank you, Jörg Wolf, not the Wolf on Wall Street, but the editor-in-chief for the Atlantic community. I would now like to invite you up to the podium or to the stage or into the chairs, and we will start our panel discussion here. So please, it's Ryanair, it's free seating. First, before going into the questions from the audience, I would like to give you a couple of questions from the remarks I have pointed down from the introductions. First of all, the liberal viewpoint. If TTIP is so good that everyone says it is, you're all in favor of concluding this agreement. And speaking from a Finnish perspective, Finland and the Nordic countries wouldn't be anything without trade and free trade. I mean, we cannot just change wooden logs with each other. But if it is so good, why is the public opinion and the civil society so skeptic about it? Why have we let the TTIP skeptics to dominate this debate in the popular media? As you foretold in The Guardian has been very active to raise those concerns. But why is that? Someone who wants to start regarding this? Okay,
well,
please.
I think that the resistance against TTIP, if you want to explain it, I'm not a political scientist, but an economist. But I think it must be put into the general resistance against capitalism, if you like, that has become very popular in the last 20 years. Remember in 1999. There was a big meeting in Genoa, and there were the first huge protests. This is now not against TTIP, but against some globalization that is viewed as the dominance of big business in the world, big business over national governments. And behind that anti-globalization view, there is also a strong dose of anti-Americanism. I'm terribly sorry to say this, but that's a fundamental motivation which pops up. You know, the modern the structure of the globalized market economy on in our information age seems to be dominated by a number of huge American companies, which were a few years ago no more than startups. But they have grown very powerful. That's the view of those people who massively use the services of these companies, by the way. And that has fostered that spirit. It is remarkable that CETA, the CETA agreement with Canada, has been more or less concluded. It has not been ratified, but it has been concluded. And it's basically the same as how TTIP started. But it's Canada, it's not America, and that makes the difference at the end of the day.
And it has an ISDS provision.
Exactly, and nobody cared for the ISDS provision because it was viewed as a relatively harmless thing because at the end of the day, it's really a country like Canada does not raise the same emotions as the American style capitalism does. So I think at the end of the day, this is the reason, but even if this is the reason, it doesn't help. You know, this is a reality we have to face. And although I agree that we will not change to what Mr. Wolf said, that we will not convince those people who are fundamentally against it, But there is a middle ground of people who are not so fundamentally against it, and which may to some extent be part of the protest, but not in the same kind of militant way, if you like, and who may finally go with it. And your idea, if I just comment on this as well, of converging to a narrow version just for pragmatic reason is very seductive, and I think it could gain exactly this middle ground of people who have switched into the anti-camp recently. On the other hand, I must warn you, as somebody who was in politics for a couple of years actively, it's very hard in negotiations to say, oh, we now stop to go for the ambitious version. We take the modest, narrow version, because then everybody says, aha, they back down, and then now we fight the narrow version. You change the agenda by, if you openly declare your proposal, you have to do it in a different tactical way. You have to go for the ambitious aim, and at the end of the day, after nights of awful negotiations and difficult negotiations, you come out and say, we finally agreed on a more modest version. You cannot announce that.
Nils Torvalds asked for the floor. Why are we so afraid of the Americans?
Probably saw too many Western films. Shoot first, ask then. Okay, but I think the center of the question is political and societal processes. And political and societal processes don't go in the same direction, always. If you look back in history, even if Carl Hagelin said we shouldn't look back, I always look back because that sort of goes with my age. From 45 up to 75, we have big political blocks, we have stability. There might be some change of government, but it's a coherent change of government. You can see it in Sweden, Denmark, Norway, the Social Democrats being in charge for 20 or 30 years. You can see Germany, where CDU, Adenauer and Erhard were in charge for 30 years. You can see it even in a Finnish perspective, but sort of Finland is in a certain way. We had a center party dominating, but there were stable blocks around politics. And then we have a tremendous change. I tried to remember who wrote it, but it was an American economist who wrote in about 66, 67, 68, that we need a certain amount of unemployment. And we were sort of shocked. How can anybody say something like that? We need a certain amount of unemployment. But he meant that we need a certain amount of unemployment of about 5, 6, 7%. Today we are up in unemployment figures of 30%. And we don't give a damn about it. We don't do actually anything about it. And then we wonder why there is a mistrust out there. And the mistrust regarding the ability for governments to check the problems is immense. And if we don't fix that, we don't fix actually so much at all. We don't fix this trade agreement, we don't fix the next elections, we don't fix the economy. So that's the reason I said we need a picture of the future, and I think you were actually speaking at the same time. Same thing, we need a picture which is realistic. If we don't come up from this valley of sorrow, or whatever we call it, how could you even imagine that anybody would vote for me?
Thank you. A picture of the future or a vision. So what shall we do to rally public support behind the TTIP? Is a TTIP light, as Jörg Wolf talked about, is that a solution going forward? What do you say, Johanna?
Yeah, thank you. I was just going to comment on the previous, which is actually very much connected to what you're asking now.
Absolutely.
I think, like as Professor Paquet was saying first, and I very much agree with Mr. Torvalds as well, I think we are facing a problem of globalization, capitalism, and people are afraid, they're disappointed with the results that globalization has brought them so far. And I think actually more than global movements, this is very much about the failure of domestic actors. When we're talking about free trade, about any trade agreement, it's very important to understand that freer trade always brings about not just losers, not just winners, but also losers. There are always people who will lose. They will lose their jobs, they will lose their business because of more competition. When you open up trade, it's all about competition, which is good for society, but it can be bad for certain individuals. And this is where our own politicians, both in Europe and America, I think have failed to a large extent during the last decades. And because when we have those losers, it's up to us as a society to compensate them. And this is where politicians have done some big failures. And now this is actually, I think it's a topic which will come up more during the TTIP negotiations later. If you're looking at the American debate at the moment, like how they were, for example, voting on the TPP agreement, the Trans-Pacific one, it was bundled up with this worker compensation program, and then it was disbundled. And it was very much a political discussion going on about the how much, what are the effects on workers and how they should be compensated. Now, where I think this is the next big thing we're going to see in Europe, if you look at the EU's new trade strategy that came out only a few weeks ago, where EU is now actually changing what I was telling you about before. I was telling you about the Global Europe strategy in 2011, which is all about commerce, money, money, money. Now we see a new strategy. The European Commission has come out with a plan which is called Trade for All. And they are talking there about the main concerns of the civil society, about sustainable development, about regulatory issues, investment. And now I was reading it today and I noticed that there was also the European Globalization Adjustment Fund was bundled up in this program. So I think the European politicians are now understanding that they have to discuss these issues. They cannot forget about the losers because that will kill the project, and it will definitely kill these politicians after these negotiations.
When Mr. Obama launched the discussions, he talked about that we shall conclude this agreement on one tank of gas. It must be a very fuel-efficient car. The two-stage rocket that I want to come back to, that Mr. Jörg Wolf talked about, that we would have a TTIP light and then going to a more comprehensive agreement. He was skeptical to what the US position is on that. What do you say, Susan? Would that be a way forward?
Jörg was absolutely right when he said that we want an ambitious agreement. We wanted to include an ISDN provision that, for us, the whole purpose of doing this is showing once again that we, the transatlantic community, can undertake something great and that we can make it happen, and that it's clearly in both our interests. So that's the path that we're still on. I would also say, compared to the TPP, this one is still in its infancy in terms of the negotiations. I read somewhere that the TPP had gone through 500 rounds, negotiating rounds, but it was a huge number. And it was over many, many years. And we're only in the second year of this. And from what I've read, we've already made huge amounts of progress. I know that there will be another, now that the TPP negotiations are concluded, frees up a few more of our negotiators to add to the ranks working on TTIP, that there's going to be another huge push in the beginning of 2016 to get this concluded, and I think that there's still huge optimism on our side that that will happen. If I could make one other comment to what we said earlier about a picture of the future that's realistic for people. And I think this is one of the things that is so hard about TTIP, because it's quite technical. And if you look at it in very plain terms, it's actually not emotional things that speak to people. It is very easy for those who want to pick something out of context, and then you can put some pictures around it and flood the internet to get it out there. It's really more in the nature of disinformation, but it's very hard to counteract. And those who are supporting it are trying to bring it down to earth, and it is very, very specific. All the different chapters, whether it's on the photosanitary, or whether it's about information exchange, whether it's looking at the actual tariff offers, that when the agreement is finished, it's something that everybody can go and take a look at. And the point is, we do agree on so much. And that there are things we can definitely say, you do it one way, we do it another way, but the end result is still safe, and it's still good for consumers on both sides of the ocean. Let's just not set up another whole testing procedure. Let's not increase the bureaucracy. Let's just recognize it and allow that particular product or service to be traded. And that's in our benefit, and it doesn't go against the values of either side of the Atlantic.
Thank you. Would UFO like to comment? You said that when you Googled a lot before coming here, and you also said that as a PR person, you could help out on this, but not for free. But would you like to give some small hints, at least for free, to us?
Well, maybe just a kind of sneak peek, so someone will pay me.
Great.
Yeah, but it's true what has been said, that there's no way to convince the kind of crazy people who, no matter what you say to them, it's not possible to change their mind. But then again, it is very possible to change opinion leaders' minds, including myself. Many people have asked from me what's up with this TTIP, and when I go to, let's say, EU's pages about TTIP, and I think I read something like 18 fact sheets yesterday, and they were pretty brilliant. Like there was this kind of controversies and answers to them, and it was pretty okay. But for example, in the very first fact sheet that you will get from the EU, if you dig deeper into this subject, an example of what benefits will TTIP kind of bring with it. Well, the second of two benefits was that tobacco industry will kind of get, I don't know, hundreds of % of more profits or something like that. Like, what the hell? Who is writing these things? So just the basic kind of understanding of PR and understanding of how you should spin things would be really good for this. And the one kind of thing is also, we're talking a lot about kind of globalization, and it's all good, but I think even a greater force is on the move now, namely the digitalization. Even if we would be really kind of how should I say, not like there would be no globalization, still there would be digitalization, and many people would lose their jobs. So as said, politicians are now really in a difficult situation. There's nothing much they can do. People will lose their jobs, probably even 50% of people at some point, or even more. And then there's not much kind of a individual politician can do, hey, let's stop the progress, or something like that. I personally believe that it's a good thing, the whole automation and robotization and all this is a good thing, but now when we are kind of trying to blame everything on globalization, I don't necessarily agree with that.
Jörg, the picture of the future that Niels talked about, is it the failure of the politicians to create a vision or a picture that has created the possibility for the civil society to use TTIP as a scapegoat?
Yes. We don't have visionary politicians in Germany. I'm not an expert on all EU countries, so I'm not going to make comments about other countries, but I think there's so much cynicism and pessimism in the EU in general. And there was in the US as well in 2007, 2008, and I was utterly surprised how when Obama ran for president, how much that has changed the mood in the US. And so yeah, visionary statements, leadership is important. We don't have these politicians over here. But at the same time, I believe now there's also a lot of disappointment in Obama. Obama has raised huge hopes and expectations in the US and in Europe, which he could not fulfill. Of course not. So there's a big danger of raising too high expectations and visions, and I think Mr. Torvalds made good arguments for that. Germany's former Chancellor Schmidt, who passed away the other day, was supposed to have said, if you have visions, you should see the doctor. And so I think what we need in Europe, rather than visions, is concrete benefits, and to create a more positive gut feeling towards a liberal agenda. Because right now, the gut feeling of most people, when you talk about liberalization, is negative. and the arguments in favor of liberalization are complicated. So that's why gut feeling is important. And you only can create this slowly, incrementally. The financial crisis has increased so much mistrust. And we are, the US has recovered much faster from the crisis than we in Europe. So we are slow, and we need progress with that. So in terms of promoting TTIP, it's not just the crazy people who oppose TTIP, and yes, the crazy people you cannot convince, but I think opposition to TTIP goes beyond a few crazy people. At least in Germany, it's in the middle of society. It's not just the left. It's many conservatives either, especially these issues on ISDS. So the way I would promote TTIP is one way would be pointing out the American concerns. Many Americans are concerned that TTIP will lead to socialism. Okay. No. What I have read is that Americans are very concerned about financial regulation, and they are proud that they have achieved stronger financial regulation in the last few years after the crisis. And the Americans on the left are concerned that TTIP is going to lower those regulatory standards. Because they see financial regulation in Europe much weaker. So I think one way to promote TTIP in Europe is to point out those American concerns. Or to point out the VW scandal. So the big German car maker Volkswagen cheated terribly, and it wasn't the German environmental NGOs, and we have hundreds of them who with tons of money who figured out that Volkswagen cheated. It wasn't the German regulators. It wasn't the EU regulators. It was an American university in West Virginia, a great state, but it's seen in Europe as kind of backwards. Okay, Americans also see it backwards. See it as hillbillies, but that's wrong. We need to be more open-minded and see the facts. They figured out this scandal, and then it was the American regulators who held Volkswagen accountable. And so we Germans need to realize we don't have the best environmental standards, the best innovative car technologies. And then if we have more honesty, more self-reflection at ourselves, then I think we are also more open and see the benefits for cooperating with the Americans on TTIP.
We'll give a short comment to Mr. Paquet.
Yes, I perfectly agree on your analysis.
Wait, the microphone is now.
I'm sorry. Where is it? I'm very bad in technology, so I perfectly agree with your analysis, but I don't think that pointing out these elements would really help to change the public mood in Germany. And I'm, in fact, in favor of a more visionary approach. I may have to see the doctor, but I think the only way to catch the imagination of people in Germany, it's my experience, by the way, from many discussions, panel discussions on this matter, is really to say and to argue that this TTIP is that those who profit from TTIP are not big companies in the first place, but small and medium-sized companies who cannot, who don't have big teams of lawyers at their hand to work the American market, but who don't enter the American market and don't produce for the American market with their employed labor force, because the risks of product liability, for instance, and all the rest of it in America are huge. And that's true. This is the way it is. And this turns around, could turn around the public mind of those people who are in the large middle ground, not the extreme left-wingers, not, by the way, the populist right-wingers who are also against TTIP, but those who reasonably think about it. But that, I don't see any politician in the forefront who has really tried to do this. They argue much too defensively. And Jörg, if I may come back to one point in your presentation, which ties back to this. You said that the economic benefits are small. Well, what we can measure in our models is small. But you know, it makes a huge difference to the long-term prosperity in our countries. Whether and to what extent startup small firms can early on enter the international market, and especially the American market, which is of huge importance, especially for technology-intensive, information technology-based startups. Whether they can enter that market, grow and limber up, or whether they cannot. And we cannot measure that in these models. So the final dynamic benefits are probably a multitude of what we measure. If you take the standard economic models, just a very brief digression, you know, no trade liberalization whatsoever in world history would have had a big effect. You never get big numbers from the static efficiency gains, technically speaking, that are connected to free trade. You only get big numbers when you think about the long-term prospect of a stable, sustainable, persistent environment for trade and direct investment. But then this is something which goes over 10, 20, 30, 40 years, and all models are dead then to protect. So the economics behind it is much more powerful than the model suggests. Therefore, and at this point I agree, coming up with all these stupid models doesn't help at all in the discussion, because the numbers are, at the end of the day, very small. So you need a kind of vision of an integration of the world economy that is not based on huge big companies which profit the tobacco industry or whatever, but on all these, you know, startups which make, and small and medium-sized firms that make the backbone of our economies and which are hindered by the situation as it is now. So the growth potential is decisive. By the way, one final point. I perfectly agree with the questions of the losers that you raised in particular. But remarkably enough, the three countries in Europe where the resistance is strongest against TTIP, Germany, Austria, and Luxembourg, have the lowest unemployment rates. And they have gone through all these crises and structural adjustments in the best feasible way. So I agree, the losers are part of the story, but even if you offer schemes of compensation, which we should, and which we do, by the way, in a country like Germany, and I think in Scandinavia it is done as well, in all countries, that losers are not left alone in our societies. There may be more left alone in America, but they are not in our societies with our welfare states, our labor market adjustment programs that we all have. So they are not left alone. But even if they are not left alone, there is this skepticism, and I think you can only fight this skepticism with the vision.
Okay, thank you.
If I could briefly.
No. Because I want to to have time to speak about one other topic before letting in the audience, and that is ISDS, Investor-State Dispute Settlement, investor protection, and so on. There are already 1,400 ISDS agreements in place worldwide. I think some 50 of them includes Finland, can be even more. And since those were introduced, I think there have been less than 100 arbitrary proceedings worldwide. So it's very few. And the agreement with Canada, the free trade agreement that EU just concluded with Canada some years ago, we have it in. No one said anything about it. Why is it suddenly a problem? That's my first question. And my second question is, if not ISDS, what then? Who wants to start? Johanna.
Ladies first.
What is different? Well, different is that now, for the first time, it is European Union. Well, from the European side, this is different. It's the European Union who is concluding these agreements. From a legal point of view, European Union did not have the competence before to conclude bilateral investment treaties. The competence was within the individual EU member states. That's why we have hundreds of these agreements also in Europe, because European countries have been concluding these agreements separately. They have chosen their preferred partners, the ones they trust, and they have gone into these agreements. And most of those agreements do include an ISDS procedure, and actually European countries have been the most active ones in the world in using this system. But now the logic has changed. Before, these agreements were mostly concluded with developing countries, such countries where Europeans were very keen to protect their own investments. Now we're entering a new era where these agreements are coming into agreements between developed countries and the competencies on EU level. And of course, you understand it's a bit different whether this, whether the Czech Republic is concluding an agreement or whether it's the European Union, because then when we're looking at the companies who might be interested in engaging these procedures, they are a bit more interested in getting compensation on the European level than on the level of Czech Republic. So we have bigger benefits, but we also have bigger risks. And why is it different with Canada and then it's with the United States? Well, Canada is a smaller country. They have maybe a bit less aggressive legal culture. I don't think that I don't think it's very logical. I think very much of the criticism that is now related to investment protection and ISDS especially is because of lack of information, but it's also because there are more risks. We're dealing with a huge economic power who has a lot of very successful companies, a lot of excellent lawyers, and they're very interested in standing up for their own interests. But so are Europeans, and Europeans also have a lot of companies who will benefit from this system. But it has to be a balanced one, and we have to think of it in from a bit different angle than we have before, because now we are in a much bigger game.
Susan.
I think the reason why this has become such a big issue is because of a couple of very high-profile cases. And they were cases that were very emotional, easy to publicize. It was involving cigarettes, and it had to do with the change in Germany's energy policy. And for those who are part of the anti-globalization movement, this was an immediate win, in a sense, of something they could take to use against the agreement negatively really easy to capture in a way for the public, very emotional. And once that's out there, you basically, I think, can't put the genie back in the bottle. But I think without that kind of visceral case, this might not have become a big issue because it's so technical. And we in the United States, we have about 50 of them. We've had very few cases over the years. Not one of them has been proven valid. So most of the cases that have come up have all been with EU countries. It is a pretty technical kind of issue. But as I said, the timing of these two cases, which still haven't been resolved, makes it easy for those who oppose the agreement to find something that will resonate with the general public.
Nils, and you follow.
Well, first of all, trust is at the very center of economy. If you go back to early German history, banking history in Augsburg, Jakob Fugger, well, the whole system was built on trust, and actually also on some welfare. If you go to Augsburg, you should also go to the Fuggerei. It's a very beautiful place for people with a small amount of money to spend, and you are still paying basically the same rent Jakob Fugger decided 400 years ago. So trust is at the very center of economy. It's also in the very center of democracy. So if we if there is something we can't trust, if there is something we can't see, then I think you have all the democratic reasons to say, if I can't see it, then I can't trust it. And we have some, from my point of view, fairly ugly examples, not the big examples you spoke about. But there is a firm in England, in London, and they always buy the cases. When a company is on the verge of going into a battle about a compensation agreement, Burtons come in and they say, if you don't have the money, we can give you the money if we get the proceeds. And I think that's like sort of buccaneering. Well, that's been English sports for a lot of years, so it's nothing new. But from the perspective of trust, it's a very, very bad system.
UFO.
Yeah, one thing about the ISDS that I guess bugs the big general public, and I'm not talking about kind of these super skeptics or none of that. I have friends like entrepreneur friends, really capitalist and really pro globalization, who are against TTIP because of the non-transparency issues. And in this kind of ISDS, I see a kind of triple-fold transparency catastrophe. Like first you have the EU, which is known for non-transparency, and like for a big public, it's something that completely, even I cannot quite figure out how it functions and what's being done there and why it's working in 2 different cities and whatnot. And that's scary enough for you. Then you have these TTIP negotiations, like secretive rooms with, I don't know, some kind of cults and papers that you cannot take with you and what have you. Well, not really, but still it's kind of has been really unnecessarily secret in some aspects. And then finally you have this ISDS, and from the leaked papers, of course, they could have been shown to public, so they would have had to be leaked. But from the leaked papers, I have understood that there has been this arbitration kind of thing going on that sounded, at least to me, really unfair. Then when you have really nothing to kind of first compare it against, you have no transparency, blah, 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 then it begins to be really annoying. Then I was brave enough to dig into the EU papers enough that I could find the ICS, like the investment court system that's now being replaced. But I had no idea if it had been replaced if it had replaced the original stupid idea because of the leaks or because of the kind of natural evolution of how negotiations go. So all this kind of non-transparency, I bet you cannot convince the really kind of left-wing activists by transparency, but you can really convince me, for example. So there's my 5 cents.
Jörg, you already told us about the holy trinity of distrust, big corporations, Americans, and the EU. What else, if not ISDS? How shall we conclude without ISDS? Is it a way forward?
I would prefer to have TTIP without ISDS concluded. The proposal from Cecilia Malmström for an investment court system also sounds good. It solves the main problems with ISDS, that it will be publicly appointed judges, not arbitrators, arbiters. Not lawyers, but judges. It will be public. There's transparency and can't think of the English word.
Buccaneer.
Berufung. Appeal. Yeah, and there will be an appeals process, and the decision of this court will be made public. Whereas with the ISDS system, it was only to be made public when both parties agreed on. But to be fair, in the past, usually it was the governments that didn't want the ISDS decisions to be made public because they were afraid that if it would be revealed, then their country would look bad for foreign direct investment. So it was less the companies who sued for ISDS. And I agree that obviously ISDS is not as bad as the critics have said, and Germany, France, the UK, the US have never lost a case in ISDS against a company. And many of the big decisions that are controversial, the Vattenfall case against Germany because Germany decided to phase out nuclear energy after the Fukushima disaster, and said okay, but Vattenfall, which probably, as you all know, is a publicly owned Swedish company, used ISDS to claim that the phasing out of nuclear energy is a kind of expropriation of their investment. And so they have a point, because the German government was like, the red-green government wanted to phase out nuclear energy, then we got a different government, they wanted to continue nuclear energy, then Fukushima happened. So I think they have a point, but at the same time, Fukushima was a big deal, and governments should have the right to take environmental concerns seriously. But the thing is, there are also many German energy companies who lose a lot of money because of the decision to phase out nuclear energy. So why should foreign companies have special rights with ISDS to sue the German government than German companies? And this argument is also brought forward by libertarians in the US, primarily from the Cato Institute, who say ISDS is supporting risk-averse foreign companies at the expense of US companies. So there are big problems with ISDS. And it's not enough to point out that ISDS is not as bad as the critics say. If the Americans want ISDS in TTIP, they need to have provide positive arguments for why is ISDS needed between Europe and the US, because in the past it was always with the developing countries with weak legal systems. And the main arguments I have heard is that TTIP should be a model treaty. so that it should be a template, so that when further trade agreements are being negotiated with China and so on, that ISDS will always be part in it. And I see that it's difficult to convince China of ISDS if the EU and the US don't have ISDS in their bilateral agreements. But at the same time, I'm not convinced that China or India would go for ISDS if there's ISDS between the EU and US. It's an open question. And there are many other countries who are opposed to ISDS. South Africa, Brazil, Australia. So if the Americans want ISDS in, they need to provide convincing arguments for it.
Nils had a comment and then Karl-Heinz Paquet.
I try to be very short. The problem of ISDS is not ISDS, but arbitration process. And arbitration is, of course, a very interesting word. Arbitrator, or arbitrary. So as soon as you go into linguistics, you find a lot of opening up in the case. But we have a very interesting case of arbitration in Finland going on for the moment. That's between Nordea and Helsinki. And there is, of course, a non-disclosure clause in the agreement. So we don't know what's happening. And that not knowing is not acceptable answer when we speak about state rules. For Nordea and Helsinki, that's their business. But for us, it's our business, and we would like to know.
Karl-Heinz. Okay.
Just follow up on what Jörg said. I think that the Malmström proposals go in the right direction if you are genuinely looking for a compromise or a range of compromise. The question, however, is what will the Americans do? And if you look at the timetable of the negotiations, I think in March there will be next year there will be negotiations on public procurement, and that is a very sensible issue in America, much more sensible than in Europe. So my last hope is that there might be in most of the negotiations at the moment it was that the blocking side was Europe and not America. But the Americans, with their huge military sector and with their resistance, their resistance to let foreigners in, they might get something for compromise in public procurement for compromising on the other issue, on the structure of the investment protection. So this is my last hope, if you like, to say that there might be some scope for dealing with the TTIP treaty, and I would warn generally to be a bit not to be too pessimistic. Negotiators, especially if they have political backing, if you're really getting down to the final stages of a negotiation and you have narrowed down the scope of the really big, extremely important and politically sensitive questions, then sometimes imagination is mobilized that was not available before. This may be also explain that the Americans in general are a little bit more optimistic than the Europeans, because they have this imagination already in the back of their minds, I hope.
So what will the Americans do? I don't see any journalists, so Susan can disclose everything now.
At the moment, all I can tell you is what we intend to do and what the president has said there. It is a negotiation, and so when it comes down to the end, that is the point of having certain parts of the negotiation not out in the public strategy. I mean, when you come down to tariff numbers, each side has to make its best offer. You decide whether you accept. What I do want to say, and it was a comment about transparency in general, We know all of the subjects being discussed. We know what the intention is for every single chapter of the TTIP agreement. What we don't know, as I say, are the specific numbers. What I would also say is that on our side, and I know the EU has done a phenomenal amount to make more available, to bring the public into it. In the US, the USTR has 28 standing committees, some 700 individuals that all get copies of the text from every single round. And these groups, it brings in the United Farm Workers, the International Labor folks, it's the Teamsters, it's a lot of the unions as well as business people who see every bit of the text. Then we have all of these public stakeholder sessions. There have been over 100 of them so far. So it's bringing people in who have a stake in this, hearing them. There was a lot of work done on our side before we started, reaching out to say, okay, if we're going to do this, you're a small and medium-sized company. What do you want? What do we try to do? What would help you export or do business transatlantically a lot better? And as well as with the ISDS, the Commission all of a sudden wasn't expecting this big uproar. They then halted the process to say, okay, wait a minute, we've got to go back, we've got to do more public hearings, we've got to restart this process because it's not working now, and reaching out to many more people. So in terms of trade negotiations, which are by nature technical and complicated, I would say that this one is far more open than previous ones, and that there really is a huge amount of literature and information that's out there. And I obviously go to the USTR's website all the time looking for things, but I also go to the EU's. And many times I've been happier with the information that's provided by the EU, more extensive than what I'm able to find on our side.
Yeah, I'm definitely not saying that not anything has been done or anything like that, only that it has been kind of slow, and it could seem that it's only because of the leaks. So kind of, I think if I would be the PR person, I would have been more open from the beginning. So of course it's easy to say now when we know how things are going. But
I'm going to give your name to Malmström.
Yeah.
But I'm not cheap.
Yeah. Okay, thank you very much. And if I will allow myself a comment, and I think the reason is that the European Commission was really caught off guard when it came to the ISDS. One didn't think that this would be such big issue as it turned out to be, because it's concluded in 1,400 agreements already. So I think that was really what surprised the European Commission. And then the professor.
I just wanted to add up something to that. Push that. You see? You're working so much.
Professor, you really need to be
I'm not used to that anymore. Anyhow, no, I mean, just to follow up on what you said,
yep.
Because the political elite in Europe was so struck by the reactions in public, they are now relatively defensive. It's very dangerous at the moment for Merkel to stand up and say, I want TTIP. So because you may lose in the game. But that may change once you really approach the final stages of the negotiations. Because then it becomes, you can hype it up politically if both sides do it. If Barack Obama comes up and says, now it's going to be the final big brickstone of my second term, of my presidency, and Merkel suddenly and other leaders in Europe stand up and say, we want TTIP and we now stand ready to compromise on major issues. And that is a way, by the way, to get back the sympathy of those middle ground skeptics, because they don't want to rock the boat at the end of the day. If really America and the European leadership stands up and say, now there is a historic opportunity and we must not miss this opportunity, I think then you have a chance again. You will never get the left wing and the populist right wing to agree, but you may get the middle ground back. But Barack Obama doesn't do that at the moment. Merkel doesn't. Cameron doesn't. Nobody does at the moment, because it would be very, very dangerous politically, as long as there is no range of options and compromises clearly defined by the negotiators. So there is a political process going on, and I hope there are professional guys there, that we finally can come close to this politically hyping up. Remember the WTO, the foundation of the WTO in the negotiations in 1993. That was close to a failure, very, very close. And then came, I think it was in December 1993, there was Clinton and the others really pushed it up to a completely different level of importance. But that moment can only be at the very end, towards the end of the negotiations.
All right, thank you very much, and thanks for all the answers. Now I will open the floor for questions from the audience. I already see 3 hands in the air. I will start 4, 5. So I will start from the first row. I will start here, and please present yourself. And also, if you would like to target the question to a particular person, please tell. And I will take 2 or 3 questions and grab them together, and then you will have the chance to reply.
Hello, thank you for a very interesting panel discussion. My name is Björn Bunstoff. I'm a political science student here at Helsinki University, and I also chair the international committee of SFP's Youth Party. Unfortunately, Niels stole my line up in the last round of the panel discussion, and I begin this question by stating that I'm not a lawyer. He is. But as he said, most of the problem that people have with ISDS don't have anything to do with ISDS, but more with arbitration as a legal procedure. And that's why I would direct my question to you, Susan, and very interested to hear what you have in favor of that as a procedure in the ISDS. And the second question is I think for Niels, and perhaps for someone else who are familiar with the new proposal from September from the Malmström cabinet, with the new, what was the name of it, investment court system instead of the arbitration system that we have. Because I think that's why this sudden opposition to it is, it's because it's become more of a general knowledge that this could also be used in this agreement, not only because we don't trust each other's juridical system. We do trust the US legal system, and the US does trust the EU system, but it's mostly because when we want to negotiate future deals with, say, China, which legal system we perhaps do not trust in the same outreach. And I talked with this with someone from Malmström's commission in our cabinet in the summer, and there have been a lot of the argument within the civil sector in Europe, I think, that if we get rid of this old system that we mainly used when we negotiated with developing countries, we could also use this in favor of a sort of a democratization argument when negotiating new deals with say China or other Asian countries. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Is the microphone on? It is on. Yes, very good. Okay. The next question here, and then and please present yourself.
Okay. Okay. I have 2 points and 1 question. First point. I'm German, and in Germany I know a gentleman now 78 years old who spent his professional life in the import-export business. And he says, summing up his experiences by saying, well, best I liked to do business with the Japanese. But worst of all, least of all, I like to do business with the Americans, because they always try to cheat you. Should one call them world champions in small print? Second point. If you look at those hopefuls who now try to become the presidential candidate of the Republican Party in 2016, most of them depend heavily on contributions from big money. Now, assuming that one of them would become president and would intend to sit 2 terms, during his first term, he would have to do exactly what big money wants. Otherwise, he wouldn't get the contributions for his election campaign for the second term. And actually, there are at least 2 scientific investigations which arrive at the conclusion that the USA are not anymore a democracy, but a financial oligarchy.
Could we get the question?
The question is, assuming that we care about climate, biodiversity, environment in general, working conditions, public health system, and so on, if we would have a good-looking agreement signed and sealed, do we believe that this would be still true when there would suddenly be a Republican president? Or would it be just turned over, rolled back for the wishes of big money? Thank you.
Okay, that was regarding climate. The last question here in the front row, it was there, and then we will take, the panel will reply to the remarks.
Göran Schultz, the devil is always in the details, and compensation for imaginary losses is very interesting. I'd like to address the question of intellectual property, and especially with the background of a broken patent system that does not protect innovation but protects outdated business models and similar things. There's a fundamental difference between the US and Europe, in the sense that in the US there's a tendency towards allowing patenting fairly queer issues like prime numbers or human genes or so on, and then sorting it out in the courts, while in Europe we try at least to keep the patent system more sensible, but that hasn't really worked, and we have a real issue when it comes to compensation in this area. Then we also have the problem of ownership of the customer base for various things. And there, so the European fundamental vision is that an individual, me, owns data about myself, while the American vision is that anybody who collects data owns that particular data.
Okay, thank you very much. First, we had a question regarding ISDS and the investment court system that I think was to Niels, but everyone can reply to, and then the climate change, if a Republican will revoke everything that is agreed in Paris, if I translate the question correctly, maybe that's Susan will reply to it, and then the intellectual property rights and the patent system. So Niels, please.
Well, thank you. Well, the problem with arbitration is that it can't actually be appealed. What Malmström said, that it should be a possibility to appeal, that also at the same time is a rule about disclosure. Because if you don't know what to do, then what the hell are you going to appeal? But a more central problem is probably the question of what's I think is called jurisprudence. That we need to have rules according to which the decision should be made. And in an arbitrary process, in arbitration, not in an arbitrary arbitration process, you don't have those rules. It can go either way, depending on who is in charge or who is sort of paying what, and there is no control. So that's, from my point of view, the question of jurisprudence is actually the most important, because then we have some surety in the long run. Then a short comment on biodiversity and Donald Trump. If Donald Trump is elected the next president, well, you probably heard him saying that there is no such thing as global warming, so he's not very much He's not very much worried about biodiversity and climate change in general. He thinks that this can be fixed. And a very short comment on patent. We have a huge problem with patents, and that's a very, very American, very, very European problem at the same time. So we need to fix it, and that has to do with data protection.
Susan, then Johanna.
Let me just make a short comment about arbitration. That in the United States anyway, there was a huge positive push in general, where possible, toward arbitration because it was seen as something infinitely less costly and much faster than going through our whole court process. And if the two parties agreed, they agreed on what it was to be about, agreed to the arbitrator and to abide by the outcome, it was in their interest to do so. It saved them money, got a result faster. So it was seen as something that in certain instances was an improvement over our court system. In general, I think the whole idea behind ISDS, every country wants to increase the amount of foreign direct investment. And so this was a tool that was brought about to make that happen. Through the years, the number of cases has never been all that high, given how many agreements exist and the length of time they've been there. So I don't think it's something that's been seen as a way to get around, but it's seen as something that's an additional assurance for people to invest in your country. On the issue of a climate change agreement, just in general, over the years, there's far much more continuity between administrations than not. And the Republicans have put all of their efforts now for 6 years into rolling back President Obama's health care plan. They have failed. And even it's acknowledged that if a Republican becomes president, it's not going to be able to overturn President Obama's health care plan. With a climate change agreement, depends a little bit what form it is. If it's actually the form of a treaty, then it's something that has to be ratified by the Senate, and that depends upon the Senate's composition. Again, I think a lot of noise gets made during an election campaign. It is people trying, or the candidates trying to get people's attention, which makes them make extreme statements. It's a very different reality once you're in office. And then many times you have other priorities, things you need to do first, rather than taking something that's already been agreed upon, putting a lot of investment to trying to roll it back. So most of the time, when there's a change of president, even when there's a change of party, the things that have been included in the past, they stay.
Johanna.
Just a few comments on the investment arbitration. And when we're talking about investment and arbitration, it is very important to separate the substance from the procedure. And here we have two quite different issues. So first we have the legal text concerning the level of investment protection that the Europeans on the one hand and the Americans on the other hand are willing to grant to investors coming from the other party. And this is the substance. And then we have the procedural part, which is the arbitration. And these are two different issues, although now in many agreements they are bundled up together and they are dealt with together, but they actually separate things. And now when we look at the EU's new proposal, the Commission proposal about the investment, permanent investment court, it's all about the procedure. And to my understanding, how the EU now sees the issue is that we have to approach the investment arbitration from a new angle, because Europe has understood that it's in really trouble in explaining why Europe needs arbitration with the US, with a very developed economy, with a very developed legal system, whereas, as we were talking about before, these agreements, this procedure used to be enforced on weaker parties, on developing countries who did have comparable legal systems. And I think from a systemic point of view, EU thinks that this system is important and we have to preserve it, but we have to now take it on the multilateral level because it becomes too difficult to propose it only with regard to EU. And on the other hand, it is very problematic if we are telling only the weaker, the developing countries that, okay, sorry guys, we don't trust you, but we need this system with you, for example, with China or other countries with less developed legal systems. But actually, from a legal point of view, I think that the investment protection rules, the substance, is actually the more relevant part. And this is where we have different approaches, different regulatory approaches, different approaches as to how much we are able to deal with risk and how we should analyze that, how much regulatory space we are willing to give to our governments. And there are quite big differences here between the European and American approach, let alone with the Western approach, so-called Western approach, and approaches elsewhere. So I think that's I think it's a wise move from the European Union, from the Commission, to now try to take the court on a multilateral level and then maybe approach separately on the substance side with individual countries.
Thank you. I see Jörg has the microphone already in his hand. Do you want to comment? And then Jufo maybe on the patents and the property rights.
Maybe only 3 brief remarks. I mean, there are also alternatives to ISDS, which are political risk insurance, and the WTO also has a dispute mechanism. And again, the Malmström's idea of the court system, I think is good, but but my concern is that the Americans are allergic to anything with the name court or international court. So I'm here pessimistic, and I hate to be pessimistic. Usually, I when it comes to transatlantic relations, I always like to be optimistic. But TTIP is just often so depressing in that sense. So I think everybody who cares about transatlantic relations should. I mean, yes, TTIP is the biggest project, but we also, I believe, have to focus on many other EU-US opportunities for cooperation, be it in climate policy or on decreasing poverty in Africa. And I think Europe and the US should cooperate there as well. And we should have debates on TTIP in the future as well, but also on many other transatlantic topics.
Jufo, would you like to comment on the intellectual property rights and patents?
Not really, but I can say something. So, kind of from my point of view, I don't know. I'm not an IPR expert or anything, but I know that in kind of practice, for example, my startups are always trying to delay all the patent things because they cost so much. So we are going through every kind of dance move to avoid really patenting, but kind of patenting something, and then we first do it in Finland and really slowly in the EU, and maybe after that in the US and all that. And that's simply because it's so horrifyingly expensive. So anything that can be done again to kind of deregulate this thing and make it go faster and cheaper, I'm really happy.
Professor?
Just a very brief note on European-US differences. I'm not a lawyer, so I'm not really competent in evaluating the differences of the legal approaches and the philosophy behind it. But I think within Europe we have also quite a lot of differences. So I mean, to always emphasize this huge gap of philosophies blocks the mind that all international deals, even within the European Union, do somehow mean making some sort of compromise and finding a common way. So this is nothing unusual, this is my indirect answer to your pessimism. And one word on the pessimism, the problem is, I think, that if TTIP fails, TTIP is now hyped up, 2 years ago, or 3 years ago, when we just started TTIP and the public was still quiet, we could have stopped it. But now it's going to have a very high political price if the world in the world public, the global public, we have to admit that America and Europe are unable to come to terms with an agreement which benefits all. So I think this is a very, very high political price, and it is a particularly high political price, looking with respect to the fact that the Americans have already concluded now an agreement with others. So, I mean, I think that a failure of TTIP would really mean that we signal the world that there is a big crack and rift in the transatlantic relationships. And I think there are quite a few others in the world who would love to see that.
Thank you. We had 2 more questions from the back. 3, we'll take them all.
Kim Weber is my name, and I have been working with IBM for 30 years, and now I'm retired, so I can speak freely now. I have one larger question and one short one. The larger question is, what really are we in big headings trying to agree upon within the TTIP? Standards is probably one of the areas, but we have not been talking about this here at all. And the other question about the arbitration process, it's obvious that the American companies can sue national states within the EU, but does it work the other way around? Can an EU company sue some organization in the US?
Thank you.
Simo Karatie from the Confederation of Finnish Industries. Thank you for a very interesting discussion that started from the values-based approach, and especially liberal values. And I guess most of us agree that the right to property is one of the fundamental liberal values that we wanted to protect in our societies and that we wanted to promote in an international forum through international agreements and organizations, like, for instance, Finland through 67 bilateral investment treaties, and Germany through at least 140 agreements. And I think this is really the essence of investment protection, so I'm echoing the comment of Johanna Jakobsson that the substance of protection is more important than the actual enforcement, which happens in very rare cases. But I would like to hear your comments on this. Thank you.
Thank you. And then the last question.
Hi, my name is Stephen Lee. I am from a company called Milton, which is a public affairs and a communications company. And I'm American. But I'm also Finnish now too. I've been here 17 years, and most recently got my Finnish citizenship. I have started a couple companies here in Finland. I have a really tight feeling with UFO over there, and my question is primarily for you, but also for everybody else, and that is, your problems that you were running into seem to be due to Finnish policy, which I've seen with a lot of entrepreneurs, like possibly a lot of, the ways that money gets transferred and a lot of these other kinds of things. Why this agreement over changing laws in Finland or making some sort of thing? Is it just that as an EU group we are more powerful to change these things to the US? Is the US unwilling to negotiate directly with Finland on some of this stuff? And I guess this goes across to all the different types of policies that are going on. We as Finland could be, in my mind, or maybe I don't just know enough, could be just allowing for this stuff to happen that would make life easier for entrepreneurs and make our trade with the US easier. And as a dual citizen, it's really nice to be able to be here in Finland and operate under Finnish rules and then easily go back to the US and operate there and work with companies. Why can't companies do the same?
All right, thank you. Before I will wrap up the questions regarding arbitration, I would like to give one specific example, and that is, it is about the time frame very often. And there is a court case going on now in Finland between the government and the shipping company Viking Line. The state, they accused the state for collecting fees for navigation routes, 12.4 million euros, too much. This was for the year 2001 to 2004. This spring, the court came with a decision that Viking Line was right, and the government appealed. But this was from 2004, and now it's over 10 years later, and they still haven't got this decision, and many companies cannot wait for this long. So that was just to give an example. So the questions, the big prize, what do we want to agree? Can European companies also sue the American government? Then the question to Johanna regarding substance, and then can't the US just negotiate with Finland directly? And then I would like to ask one more question myself, and that it goes to Johanna and to the European speakers here. The legal system that we speak so much.
We are all European speakers. Oh.
No. So the legal system that, well, the legal system can take care of this. We are democracies, the European Union and US. Are we? Is my question. The Hungarian government, for example, they changed the interest rates for mortgages for when they had lots of mortgages denominated in Swiss franc, and they took a political decision to exchange that to the Hungarian forint. And is that a legal system we can rely on? That's my question. But I don't know who will start. Susan has the microphone.
I have the microphone in my hand. So, to the larger question of what do we agree on, there what I would suggest, I mean, there are very clearly delineated chapters for each of the subject areas that we're covering, and that you can go on certainly to the United States Trade Representative's website, and you can see all of the very specific chapters. I would also say that those chapters very much mirror what's in the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, and that whole agreement is online. It has an SME chapter, photosanitary, tariffs, etc. And with us, anyway, we explain what our goals are for each of those chapters, what kinds of things we're aiming to do. From our side, one area is being able to share information, and regulators talk to each other when establishing new regulations. We think that there's so many new kinds of industries, products, things that we don't know yet coming online, but we know we have to regulate. Couldn't we talk and come up with those regulations together rather than independently, and make it more difficult for the industries of the future, just as one example. The other specific question, Johanna, maybe you can help me out on this one about companies suing the American government. I know that there are specific rules about what the US will entertain or not, but I'm not 100% sure. Johanna, do you know?
I have an idea,
yeah. Johanna will continue.
Thank you. Just to answer to you directly, Susan, if I've understood it correctly, this is a very complicated issue under international law. It's an issue where you have where the domestic laws are combined with international law, and it's a bit different in every country. And to my understanding, in the legal system of the United States, international agreements, such as international trade agreements, they are not directly irrevocable in domestic courts, which means that an applicant going to an American court cannot directly invoke an international trade agreement, but it must have a basis in the American legal system. And this is the case in many other countries as well. And many European countries work like this as well. Now there's some shift with the integration of the European Union, while the European Union is starting to conclude more and more international agreements, and the European Court of Justice has actually given direct effect also to some international agreements, but they must have a very, very direct impact on the applicants. But Europe is maybe a bit further in this sense. And this is one of the main concerns of the European companies when they are entering the American market, because even though America has a very developed legal system, but it's not always as effective for international applicants, because they might not be able to go to the domestic courts and invoke the provisions of international trade and investment agreements. And this is now what we are trying to approach and correct with ISDS, with the United States, and with many other of our trading partners. But here, like Simo Karetti brought up again the issue of substance and the procedure. So as they are separate entities, but of course they really relate to each other, because the substance does not help at all. Even if we have great substance, great investment protection, we cannot do anything with it if we cannot enforce it. So this is where the arbitration, or no matter what other system comes into play. And
I think Kimba should ask about possibilities to sue the single American states.
Yes, single American states. Well, yeah, that's a very, very good question. But it's to my understanding, it's a similar problem on the state level as it's on the level of the federation. That you cannot go to state courts and invoke international agreements. It actually might be even more difficult than in the case of the whole country. And actually, I think we don't now have time to go that into much detail, but the state structure of the United States in general is a very big problem, as is the state structure of the European Union, because like as in the European Union, much of the legislation, trade-relevant legislation, is taken on the member state level. The same applies to the United States. Much of the legislation is taken on the state level. And I think I have to a little bit disagree with Professor Paquet when you stated earlier that why should we be concerned about public procurement when like ISDS should drive over public procurement. But I actually think that public procurement and the kind of issues that are very much still on the regulation of the state level, that's exactly the problem we should tackle. And if you're looking at the economic benefits, what would be most beneficial for all those small and medium-sized European companies who want to access the American market, who want to take their patents and their business model there, they need to deal with the states, and the states are the ones that we need to attack, especially in questions such as public procurement and regulations relating to services. This is hugely important.
Mm. Yeah, Jörg Wolf, do you want to come in? No? No? Okay, no. Then you don't need to come in because we are running out of time, but Professor Paquet wants to come in. And then
no, I wanted to come back. First a note on public procurement. I did not. I meant the question. I was looking politically for a scope for compromises. Where can America gives if America gives way a bit with respect to the arbitration, there must be some compromise on another side. Not on that. Let's not compromise. Okay. So, I mean, I wanted to come back to Matt's point about what about the reliability of legal systems. That's a very important point, and it ties back to what I said before. You know, we are in Europe very, very different. Look at countries like Bulgaria and Romania, and for that matter now Hungary. Bulgaria and Romania are usually ranked very low with respect to the reliability of their legal systems. They are in this respect a little bit like developing countries. So they are not. So we have huge difference, and would of course have much more trust in the working of the American system than to go to court in Bulgaria. Let's hope that this changes in due course, but it hasn't changed yet. And what Orban has done actually was, well, to say the least, a very unorthodox policy, which we carried through in the last few years, which would not have been possible in a country like America. So we should, I think, in this respect, cool down a little bit. And there has been an odd, I may almost say arrogance, developing in Europe in the course of this discussion. we did not recognize the huge heterogeneity that we have in Europe, and that we ourselves have to do a lot of homework in this respect in the years to come.
Niels.
Can I continue just on this note, because I think that is actually the very center of all European problems for the moment. The European process started with 6 countries, of which 5 were fairly similar to each other, of which 3 were actually more or less the same. Now we are 28, and the question and the problem of asymmetry is immense, and we don't understand it. I've tried to figure out some academic work about asymmetries, and I wrote to some of my friends at different universities, and I got an answer, very nice answer. Well, this is something we have to think on, which is not much of an answer. So, and we are arrogant despite this. So we have to get our act together to understand that a decision made from Brussels' point of view doesn't actually work in Bulgaria or Romania or even the Czech Republic. So we have to understand how the asymmetries actually are working. And on the top of that, we have actually a asymmetric problem with law, because we have German law, traditional in Finland, and we have Anglo-Saxon law. The ways of doing laws in these systems are hugely different. And then Brussels come in and meddles, thinking that we actually fixed it, but we didn't. I was a pessimist also.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Ufo, want to come in?
Yeah, if I understood the question correctly, it was like kind of why Finland wouldn't work alone with these issues, and I think it's very much kind of I'd sincerely hope that it would, but nowadays it seems that although we have Slush and all these beautiful events and everyone's talking about startups, but what has been really done lately for startups and entrepreneurship in Finland and R&D, which is in the core of the kind of entrepreneurship that I love, actually kind of we have been cutting Tekes funding almost to half of what it used to be, like the subsidies have been cut by 213 million during 2012 to 2014. So this is the practice. We speak like beautifully about startup, but there's not much to be seen. In other EU countries, subsidies have been added to R&D, but in Finland they have been halved. And in Finland we are taking currently money away from science, which basically crumbles all startup or at least unique ideas for startups. And the government is more interested in going back to forest and shipbuilding than in digitalization. So in that sense, while I fully agree that yes, we should work even alone, I also say that it's better to work with the EU now because it seems to understand what's going on better than Finland right now. And also there's the aspect of kind of me wanting to westernize Finland instead of Finlandization, I don't know. But kind of so it's very bright idea, at least for me to kind of act together with European Union.
Thank you very much. We are only 6 minutes over the time, so we have coped very well. A couple of comments to conclude, and that is, what is the big prize? I was visiting BMW, the car manufacturer in Munich a couple of years ago, or 2 years ago, I think it was, and as also was pointed out in some remarks here, the car manufacturers, they are spending so much money, millions, hundreds of millions, to meet different standards in different markets. And the BMW pointed it out in bumpers on the cars, and they said American regulators, they want to have hard bumpers, so when hit the pedestrian, you won't be suffering. It won't. There will be no damage on the car. While
while the European regulators, they want to have soft bumpers, so when you will hit the pedestrian or something else, you will damage the car, but you will not damage the pedestrian. So we need to find a middle way here to cut out regulatory burden, and here is a big price to achieve by finding the same standards. Secondly, as a politician, I think it was very important what Jufo said, how to spin this, how to spin TTIP. I think TTIP to some extent is a bit like the work on climate change. We are talking a lot, but not achieving so much. We talk the talk, but do not walk the walk. And that is because it's fairly unconcrete, it's abstract, and we need to be really much more concrete. What will this really achieve for, not only for Finland or for US or for Ohio, but for smaller communities like Dayton, Vasa, Åbo, and other real regions? What will those companies achieve and benefit from the TTIP? I think we need to be much more successful to breaking it down to small and medium enterprises, and so that normal people understands it, so it will not be a discussion between an elite and crazy people. We can continue the discussion over our lunch here, but last but not least, I would like to thank the panel and thank for all the active questions from the audience, and by closing this seminar. And I think we need to give a big applause to the panel. Thank you.